I want to finish off talking with you about cultural context and pick up where I left off. We talked about one feature of the broad or the general cultural context of the first century world, that part of the world behind the text that is broadly or generally understood in the world of the first century and which lies behind the New Testament text in that broad or general sense. Now let's narrow down our focus a bit from the broad context to the world of the authors and audiences of the books in the New Testament. Let's consider for a moment one of the cultural features of context or background that concerns one of the four Gospels, the Gospel according to John. What are some questions we could ask about John chapter 4? Questions that would help us learn more, not about the whole New Testament or the whole New Testament world, but just that book and just that chapter. Well, if we were talking about the Gospel of John, we could ask questions like, what was the identity of the author? Is John the Apostle the author, or is there some other John involved? Who's the audience of John's Gospel? Who were they? What were the realities that formed their cultural context? Was the context of the writer, John, or another author? Was that the same as the context of the readers? Or, as church tradition says, was John the Apostle writing from Ephesus for readers in different locations, perhaps? To the extent we can answer questions like that, and that extent will vary depending on the evidence available and the value we place on it, questions like these can be very useful in interpreting texts throughout a New Testament book. And just so you know, I do believe, in fact, that John the Apostle is the writer, or at least the source of most of the material in the gospel that bears his name. But questions of authorship and questions about the author and about the audience and about the date when something is written, scholars call these classic questions of New Testament introduction, or classic questions of New Testament criticism. And don't be put off by that word criticism, because when scholars use it, they use it to indicate a process of sifting through and weighing evidence in order to form a conclusion or a judgment about something. The Greek word for that kind of thing is kritikos, and that's where the English word criticism comes from. Many scholars today have reservations about answering these classic questions with too much confidence or too much specificity. And as I've already told you, that's one of the primary reasons that literary and canonical criticism has come to the forefront in New Testament studies today and replaced historical criticism, which had been at the forefront in the 20th century. But that's enough for now about cultural context, both broad and specific, at least in terms of a whole book. I want to continue on in the next lecture and the next part of this lecture, actually, and try to show you how important it is to the world inside the text and the world in front of the text. So let me begin to do that now. Let me start off by asking you to consider with me a familiar story from the Gospel of John. The story is often called the story of the woman at the well. It's found in the 4th chapter of John's Gospel. And in terms of cultural context, the first thing to say is that the world inside this text, as is true almost always of the world inside a text in the New Testament, reflects the broad general cultural context that surrounds it in the first century world in general, in that part of the world behind the text. It also reflects the more specific context of the author and the audience that I've just talked to you about. But there's a third context to consider culturally, and that has to do with a particular text, a particular part of a gospel book, or any other book of the New Testament. And I want to think with you now about that specific kind of cultural context in relationship to John chapter 4 and the story of the woman at the well. As we begin to do that, let's think about some of the questions that we might want to ask about this part of the Gospel of John, and about the cultural context that concerns just this part, just this story, the story about the woman at the well. Well, some questions that we might want to ask would be questions like these. Since this woman is identified as a Samaritan, who were the Samaritans? Where did they originate as a people with a separate name? What's their history from that point to the point of this story where Jesus encounters the Samaritan woman? What are the features that are distinctive about their culture? What are the features their culture shares with other cultures around them in the first century? We could, for instance, want to ask even more specific questions. The unnamed woman in the text, and why is she unnamed? Ask Jesus at one point, are you greater than our father Abraham who gave us this well? So culturally and historically, what's the story behind the well? And wait a minute, I thought Abraham was the father of the Jewish nation. So what's the relationship between Samaritans and Jews? And speaking about relationships, why does John tell us as he narrates this story that Jews have no dealings with Samaritans? Why does the author think this detail is important? Why does the author think his audience might need to have it supplied for them? These are questions about the author and the audience and the text that are narrower than the broad questions we've already asked about first century culture in general and the culture of a particular author and audience. We could ask questions about the woman. How was a woman who had 5 previous husbands? How was this kind of woman valued or not valued in terms of social status in Samaritan society, or in Jewish society for that matter? Why is she alone when she comes to the well? We could even ask questions about this woman, and a specific question that was on the minds of Jesus' disciples when they came back from the village, according to John, who's telling the story. For he says there was a question like this, one the disciples were afraid to ask, but was on all their minds. Why was Jesus talking with a woman? Now, just as an aside for a moment, once when I was teaching this text to an audience in a church, a woman put up her hand when I talked about that question, and when I called on her, she said to me and to all of us, well, why wouldn't he be? Why wouldn't he be indeed? In one sense, that's a question that indicates how easy it is for us to interpret a story we read in a New Testament book like the Gospel of John from the viewpoint of our culture, our existence. In another sense, it's leading us right into the direction in terms of understanding what I call the countercultural context of the world within many of the texts in the New Testament. You see, if you had been a reader of John's Gospel, reading it aloud for yourself, or hearing it as it was read in a Christian community in the late first century, perhaps the last decade, you might have had the same question on your mind as the disciples did, but were afraid to ask. Because the fact that Jesus in this story chooses to talk with a woman who comes to a well by herself, a woman who's a Samaritan, not part of the broad cultural context of the first century. Of course, there were exceptions to this, and it's important to know that, but John goes out of his way almost to acknowledge Jesus' conversation with this woman aroused questions in the minds of his disciples, and to leave the question dangling unanswered at the end of the story. Why? Well, partly because it's a historical question. It's part of what actually happened, but also it seems very likely a question that's stated and left unanswered because it's part of the way John wants to allow the countercultural aspect of this story and Jesus' attitude toward women to emerge in the world inside the text. For the truth is that often in the Gospel of John, Jesus interacts with women in ways that are countercultural from the perspective of first century culture, both Samaritan culture and Jewish culture. And this notion of a countercultural context exists in John and the other Gospels, not only with respect to women, but with respect to many aspects of Jesus' life and teaching. Think, for instance, of the countercultural context set up by Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, in the world within the text of Matthew, Or how about the countercultural story in Mark chapter 7, in which Jesus, Mark informs his readers and hearers, his audience, in which Jesus, quote, declares all foods clean. So in terms of the cultural context of the world inside the text, I hope you will remember both the way that the world reflects the broader cultural around it, and many times the culture of the author and the audience, but not necessarily the same kinds of cultures, and even how a cultural world can be reflected in a particular text, inside a particular text, inside a book written by an author, heard by an audience, living in a first century world. In the next video, we'll go on to say something more about the world in front of the text.